The wind in the crazy mountains does not just blow. It screams through the jagged limestone peaks with a frequency that vibrates in your marrow, a low constant hum that sounds like a choir of the damned trying to find their way home. By the fourth day of the search for Aaron Hedges in late September of 2014, that sound had begun to eat at the search teams. They were looking for a man who should have been a ghost in these woods, a hunter who knew the ridges of Montana better than he knew the hallways of his own home. He had separated from his friends to find a cache of supplies, a simple 3-mile trek through familiar territory, but the mountain had pulled a shroud over his eyes. The snow had started falling, then heavy and wet, turning the vibrant autumn forest into a monochrome nightmare where every tree looked like a hunched figure and every shadow looked like a doorway to nowhere. The searchers moved in grids, their breath blooming in the frigid air like gray flowers, but the land refused to yield a single footprint. Then a call came over the radio that chilled the searchers more than the freezing rain ever could. They had found his boots. Not discarded in a pile and not left behind in a camp, but sitting there on a high ridge miles from where he had last been seen. They were upright, as if he had simply stepped out of his physical form and kept walking into the ether. The terrain where those boots were discovered was a jagged mess of scree and sharp rock that would shred a pair of thick woolen socks in 20 minutes. Yet there were no bloody footprints, no signs of a struggle, and no Aaron. Just 2 empty leather vessels staring back at the sky, surrounded by a silence so heavy it felt like lead in the ears of the men who found them. As the days bled into weeks, the searchers found more fragments of a story that made no sense. They discovered a small fire he had built, a desperate flicker against the encroaching dark, but it was miles in the opposite direction of his destination. Near the fire they found his camouflage backpack and his water bottle, but the man himself remained a phantom. It was as if Aaron was being unmade piece by piece, stripped of his utility and his protection by some unseen force that wanted him vulnerable. The investigators looked at the map and realized he had crossed a mountain pass that even seasoned climbers avoid during a storm. To do that in the dark, in the snow without boots, defied every law of human physiology and survival instinct. It was as if he was being pulled toward a specific point on the compass, a destination that only he could see through the blinding white of the Montana blizzard. The search was eventually called off as the winter snows buried the crazies in a thick, suffocating blanket of white. For months, Aaron Hedges was a name whispered in local bars, a cautionary tale about the mountains that earned their name for a reason. The locals tell stories of the crazies being a place where the veil is thin, where the old ones still walk the ridgelines, and the air carries a static charge that can drive a sane man to his knees. They talk about the vanishing people, the ones who walk around a bend in the trail and simply cease to exist in this dimension. It was not until June of the following year, when the thaw finally peeled back the layers of ice, that the final piece of the puzzle was found. A rancher miles away on the other side of the range was checking his fences when he saw something white and unnatural snagged in the brush of a steep drainage. It was Aaron, or what was left of him. His remains were found on a south-facing slope that had been searched multiple times by ground crews and infrared cameras during the initial disappearance. He was miles from his boots, miles from his fire, and miles from his gear. He was found in a place that required him to scale vertical rock faces and navigate through dense, tangled deadfall that would be nearly impossible for a healthy man with full equipment to traverse. His clothes were scattered, but not in the way a man suffering from paradoxical undressing would leave them. They were placed folded in some instances, as if he were preparing for a ritual that required him to be as naked as the day he entered the world. The coroner could not determine a cause of death, leaving the official record as an empty line that mocked the family left behind. The investigation into the death of Aaron Hedges left more questions than answers, a gaping wound in the logic of the wilderness. How does a man travel that distance over that terrain without footwear and leave no trace for the most advanced tracking teams in the country? Why did he abandon his gear when the cold was his primary enemy? The cynical observer might say he lost his mind to the elements, but those who know the crazies know that madness here has a different flavor. It is a calculated external pressure that seems to hunt the lone traveler, waiting for a moment of weakness to slip inside the mind and turn the world upside down. Aaron was not just lost in the woods. He was being led through them by a shepherd we cannot see toward a finality that we are not meant to understand. This pattern of impossible travel and discarded clothing is not an isolated incident in the dark corners of our national forests. Take the case of Jaryd Atadero, a 3-year-old boy who vanished in the Comanche Peaks wilderness of Colorado in 1999. His remains were found years later high up on a cliff face that would have been impossible for a toddler to climb even with the best equipment and a team of guides. His tiny fleece jacket was found perfectly intact, showing no signs of the wear and tear that years of exposure to the elements should have caused. Like Aaron, Jaryd seemed to have been transported to a location that defied the physical capabilities of his body. These stories are the jagged teeth of a predator that has no name, a force that treats the mountain ranges of the West as its own personal larder. We look for footprints in the dirt and heat signatures in the brush, but perhaps we should be looking at the spaces between the trees. There is a weight to the air in these places, a feeling of being watched by eyes that do not blink and do not care for our laws of physics. Aaron Hedges went into the mountains to find a cache of supplies, but he found something else entirely. Something that stripped him of his boots, his clothes, and eventually, his life, leaving only a scattered collection of bones to tell a story that ends in a scream. The crazies remain there, cold and indifferent, waiting for the next traveler to step off the trail and into the mouth of the unknown. We are left only with the silence of the peaks and the lingering feeling that some mysteries are never meant to be solved, only feared. The crazy mountains do not care about your experience or your gear. They are a jagged granite crown sitting on the head of Montana, a place where the wind sounds like a low vibrating hum that vibrates in the marrow of your bones. To the locals, they are simply the crazies, and they earned that name long before we started putting fences around the wilderness. There is a specific kind of cold there, a dry predatory chill that seeks out the gaps in your layers and the cracks in your resolve. It is a place of sharp angles and deceptive distances where a ridge that looks a mile away might take you half a day to reach, or it might never let you arrive at all. You walk into those peaks and you feel the weight of centuries pressing down on you, the crushing indifference of the stone. The air itself feels thin, not just from the altitude, but as if the oxygen is being rationed by something that doesn't want you to breathe too deeply. Aaron Hedges was not a novice, not some city dweller who wandered off the path looking for a scenic photo. He was 38 years old, a man built for the rugged terrain, a man who knew how to pack a bag and track a trail through the thickest timber. In September of 2014, he set out with two friends for a week-long hunting trip that should have been a routine exercise in endurance and patience. They were headed into the heart of the crazies, aiming for a high-altitude camp where the elk moved like shadows through the dark timber. Aaron was carrying a heavy pack, the kind of weight that anchors a man to the earth, reminding him with every step that he is a creature of gravity and effort. But something happened on that mountain that defied the laws of weight and distance, something that began with a simple decision to take a different path. It was a choice that would lead him into a geography that no map could ever truly represent. It was the 7th of September when Aaron decided to break off from his companions to find a cache of supplies they had dropped earlier in the season. He was only supposed to be gone for a short while, a quick detour through the familiar, if punishing geography of the hunt. The sky was a bruised purple that afternoon, the kind of atmosphere that precedes a mountain storm heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. His friends watched him walk away, a solitary figure moving with purpose into the deepening shadows of the trees until the green swallowed him whole. They did not know then that they were watching a man walk out of our reality and into something much older and hungrier than a Montana winter. The silence that followed his departure was not the peaceful quiet of the woods, but a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb the sound of his footsteps before they even hit the ground. The mountain was already closing the door behind him. When Aaron did not return to the designated meeting point, the air changed, turning from a crisp autumn evening into a sharp, biting panic. His friends searched the immediate area, calling his name into the vast, unresponding canyons, but the only answer was the mocking echo of their own voices bouncing off the granite. By the time the official search and rescue teams arrived, the mountains had decided to stop cooperating entirely, as they so often do when a life is on the line. A storm rolled in a white wall of snow and wind that erased tracks and froze the world in a monochromatic haze of ice and grit. The searchers were professionals, men and women who had spent their lives reading the language of the wilderness, but they found nothing but static. No broken branches, no disturbed soil, no sign that a 200-pound man with a 50-pound pack had ever passed through the area. It was as if he had been lifted clean off the earth. It was nearly a week later when the first piece of the puzzle surfaced, and it was a piece that did not fit the frame of a standard missing person case. Searchers found Aaron's water bottle and a few small items miles away from where he was last seen in a direction that made absolutely no sense for a man trying to reach a supply cache. The terrain between his last known location and the discovery site was a nightmare of steep scree slopes and tangled blowdown that would break the ankles of a mountain goat. To traverse it in the dark during a storm would have been a feat of superhuman endurance, yet there were no signs of a struggle or a frantic scramble. The water bottle sat on the ground, as if it had been placed there by a hand that was not shaking, a calm gesture in the middle of a chaotic disappearance. This was the first hint that Aaron was no longer in control of his own journey, or perhaps he was being led by a logic we cannot grasp. The mountain has a way of rearranging your priorities until the only thing that matters is the next impossible step. The discovery of his boots is where the narrative of a lost hunter turns into something much darker and more inexplicable than a simple tragedy. 2 years after Aaron vanished, a pair of boots was found on a ridge, miles further into the wilderness, far beyond where any reasonable person thought he could have traveled. They were not just lost, they were abandoned, sitting side by side in the dirt, as if the person wearing them had simply stepped out of them and kept walking into the void. Think about the physical reality of that for a moment, the sheer visceral agony of it. To walk across the jagged volcanic rock of the crazies without footwear is to subject yourself to a level of pain that the human mind is designed to avoid at all costs. Every step would be a flaying of the skin, a crushing of the small bones in the feet against the indifferent stone, yet there was no blood on the rocks. It was as if he had become weightless, or as if the ground had softened specifically for his passing. Along with the boots, searchers eventually found his pack, and his rifle discarded like trash that was no longer needed for the journey ahead. A hunter's rifle is his lifeline, his primary tool for survival and defense, yet Aaron had left it behind as if it were a useless weight from another life. The pack containing the very supplies he had been searching for was found in a similar state of abandonment, its contents untouched by the elements or the local wildlife. It is as if he were shedding his humanity piece by piece, stripping away the layers of civilization until there was nothing left but the raw, shivering animal underneath. Some suggest hypothermia and the phenomenon of paradoxical undressing, where the dying brain perceives freezing cold as burning heat. But paradoxical undressing usually happens in the final moments of life, in a small radius, not over a journey of several miles across impossible terrain. Aaron was moving with a purpose that defies the symptoms of a freezing mind. In 2015, the final chapter of Aaron's physical existence was found by a rancher on the other side of the mountain range, miles from the search zone. His remains were scattered near a fence line, a collection of bleached bones that told a story of a long, lonely end in the high country. The location was nearly 10 miles from where he had first disappeared, a distance that required crossing over high mountain passes and through dense, lightless forests that have never seen a trail. He was found on private land in an area that had been searched by air multiple times, yet he appeared as if he had just fallen from the sky. The coroner looked at the bones and found nothing, no marks of predation that preceded death, no broken limbs that would explain a fall. It was as if Aaron Hedges had simply run out of soul, his body collapsing into the dirt once the energy that was driving him finally flickered out. The cause of death was left blank, a silent admission that the system had failed to understand what happened in those woods. We have to look at the geometry of this disappearance to understand the horror of it, the sheer physical impossibility of the path he took. To get from the point where his boots were found to the point where his bones were discovered, Aaron would have had to navigate a landscape that would challenge an elite mountaineer in broad daylight. He did it presumably in the dark, without shoes, and without the gear that would have kept him warm against the killing frost. There is a theory in these cases of a phenomenon called a high-energy state, where the victim is propelled by something external, a force that moves them through the woods at a pace that defies physical logic. It is as if the mountain itself becomes a conveyor belt, pulling the individual toward a specific predetermined destination that we are not meant to see. You are no longer the navigator of your own life. You are the cargo in a transport system that operates on a frequency we cannot hear. The crazies are full of these invisible currents. Searchers often report a strange atmosphere in the areas where these disappearances occur, a thickening of the air that feels like the moments before a massive lightning strike. There is a silence that is too heavy, a total absence of bird calls or the scurrying of small mammals that usually fills the forest floor. It is the silence of a predator that has achieved perfect camouflage, a presence that exists just outside the spectrum of human vision. Some call it the shimmer, a distortion in the air that suggests something is moving through the trees without disturbing a single leaf or snapping a single dry twig. Aaron Hedges might have been followed by this presence, a shepherd that guided him away from his friends and into the high cold places where the air is thin and the logic of the world begins to fray at the edges. When the shimmer decides to walk with you, you go where it leads. This is not just about one man in Montana, and that is the most unsettling part of the entire investigation. When you look at the records, you see the same jagged teeth appearing again and again across the national parks of North America, a pattern of disappearances that defies the law of averages. We see the discarded clothing, the impossible distances, and the strange ritualistic placement of items left behind by the missing. We see the way the weather always seems to turn as soon as the person vanishes, as if the earth itself is trying to wash away the evidence of a crime we cannot comprehend. These are not simple accidents, they are extractions, surgical removals of human beings from the face of the planet. Something is reaching into our world and pulling people out, leaving behind only the husks of their former lives to baffle the investigators and haunt the families who are left to wonder. The patterns are there if you are brave enough to look at the map. Consider the case of Keith Parkins, a 2-year-old boy who disappeared from his grandfather's ranch in Ritter, Oregon in 1952. He was found 19 hours later, nearly 12 miles away, having crossed 2 mountain ranges and multiple barbed wire fences in the dead of night. Like Aaron, he had traveled a distance that was physically impossible for his age and size, especially in the freezing cold of an Oregon night without a coat. He was found alive, face down in the snow. But he could never explain how he had gotten there or what had carried him across the wilderness like a leaf on the wind. The similarity lies in the displacement, the sudden and violent movement of a human being from one point to another without any logical explanation for the transit. It is as if they are being moved through a fold in the world, a shortcut that only the predator knows how to use. What is it that stalks the high ridges and the deep sunless canyons of our national forests? Some researchers point to ancient legends of creatures that can manipulate the perception of their prey, turning a familiar trail into a labyrinth of shifting shadows. Others speak of infrasound, low-frequency vibrations that can cause intense feelings of dread, nausea, and disorientation, leading a person to flee blindly into the darkness. But even infrasound doesn't explain the missing shoes or the lack of tracks in the soft mud and fresh snow. There is a deliberate nature to these events, a sense of a cold analytical mind at work that views us with a terrifying indifference. It is as if we are being studied by something that views us not as people but as biological specimens to be harvested and discarded once the useful data has been collected. We are cattle in a pasture that we mistaken for a playground. The crazy mountains still stand there, their peaks cutting into the Montana sky like the teeth of a rusted saw. They do not give up their secrets easily, and the case of Aaron Hedges remains a jagged wound in the history of the region, a story that refuses to be smoothed over by time. Every year more people go into the woods, and every year a few of them simply blink out of existence without a sound or a struggle. We tell ourselves stories about bears and mountain lions to keep the fear at bay, because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate in the middle of the night. We want to believe that if we are prepared, if we have the right gear and the right training, we are safe from the things that move in the shadows. But Aaron Hedges was prepared. He had the gear and he had the training, and none of it mattered when the mountain decided it was time for him to go. The gear is just a comfort for those who are still allowed to stay. We are left with the silence of the bones and the empty spaces on the map where Aaron once walked. The search for Aaron Hedges ended, but the questions he left behind continue to grow like moss on a shaded stone in a place where the sun never reaches. Why did he take off his boots when the ground was a bed of knives? Why did he leave his rifle when he was alone in a land of predators? How did he cross those miles of broken earth without leaving a single trace for the hounds or the helicopters? Perhaps he is still out there in some way, a ghost in the machine of the wilderness, a warning to those who think they can master the wild with a compass and a map. The woods are not our home. They are a vast, indifferent cathedral where we are only temporary guests at best. And sometimes the cathedral decides to keep its visitors forever. The disappearance of Aaron Hedges mirrors the haunting case of Jaryd Atadero, a 3-year-old who vanished in the Colorado mountains in 1999. Jaryd's remains were found years later, on a high, inaccessible cliff face, his clothing still intact and showing no signs of age despite years of exposure to the sun and snow. Similarly, the case of Danny Philippidis, who disappeared from a ski resort in New York and turned up 6 days later in California, with no memory of how he traveled 3,000 miles. These cases suggest a phenomenon that ignores the boundaries of geography and the limits of human endurance, a force that operates on a scale we are only beginning to glimpse. They are the echoes of a mystery that we are still no closer to solving. A pattern of disappearances that leaves us looking over our shoulders every time we step into the shade of the trees. The mountains are watching, and they have all the time in the world.